October 30th, 1942. The eastern Mediterranean is a void of churning black water and howling wind. On the deck of the destroyer HMS Petard, searchlights slice through the darkness, illuminating a steel leviathan struggling in the swell. It is U-559, a German wolf forced to the surface, its hull groaning under the stress of a 10-hour depth charge assault. The air reeks of diesel fumes, cordite, and the metallic tang of fear. Amidst the shouting of orders and the frantic scramble of the boarding party, a figure stands near the rail who looks entirely out of place. He is not a seasoned officer. He is not a hardened Marine. He is Thomas Brown, a 16-year-old canteen assistant who lied about his age just to scrub floors and serve tea. In this moment of absolute chaos, the rigid hierarchies of the Royal Navy are about to dissolve. As the U-boat rolls violently in the waves, taking on water, Brown stares at the open conning tower. He does not know that inside that sinking iron coffin lies the mathematical key to ending the Battle of the Atlantic. He simply knows that two officers are jumping across the gap and they will need help. Without an order, without hesitation, the boy steps off the safety of the destroyer and plunges into the history books. By the autumn of 1942, the Atlantic Ocean had transformed from a shipping lane into an open graveyard. The early optimism of the war had evaporated, replaced by the cold, crushing reality of logistical strangulation. Great Britain, an island nation utterly dependent on imports for food, fuel, and raw materials, was slowly being asphyxiated. Every month, hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping were being sent to the bottom of the sea. The horizon was no longer a symbol of hope, but a source of terror, where the silhouette of a periscope or the white streak of a torpedo wake meant almost certain death. This was the peak of the German U-boat arms efficiency, a period where the grey wolves hunted with near impunity, guided by an intelligence network that the Allies suddenly could not hear. For the first years of the war, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, housed in their drab huts in the English countryside, had managed to pierce the veil of German communications. They had read the three-rotor Enigma traffic, rerouting convoys away from wolf packs and giving the Royal Navy a fighting chance. But in February 1942, the lights at Bletchley Park effectively went out. The German Kriegsmarine, paranoid about security and realizing their movements were being anticipated, introduced a technological leap that devastated Allied intelligence. The M4 Enigma machine. This was not merely an upgrade, it was a fortress of cryptography. Unlike the standard three-rotor machines used by the German Army and Air Force, the M4 utilized a fourth rotor, specifically designed for the U-boat fleet. This addition increased the possible permutations of the cipher exponentially. Suddenly, the Shark cipher, the code used by Atlantic U-boats to coordinate their attacks, became an opaque wall of noise. The bomber machines, the electromechanical forerunners to computers used by Alan Turing and his team to crunch the ciphers, were rendered impotent against the new complexity. They simply could not process the variables fast enough to be useful. The consequences of this intelligence blackout were immediate and catastrophic. Allied convoys, now sailing blind, were stumbling directly into waiting patrol lines of U-boats. The sinking skyrocketed. In November 1942 alone, shipping losses would approach 800,000 tons, a rate of attrition that was mathematically unsustainable. Winston Churchill, a man rarely prone to public despair, privately confessed that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. The Admiralty knew that if the Atlantic lifeline was severed, Britain would starve. The planned American build-up in Europe would become impossible, and the war would be lost before a single soldier set foot in France. The desperation in London was palpable. Bletchley Park's cryptanalysts were working around the clock, their eyes red and minds fraying, but mathematics was a cruel master. They calculated that without a physical capture of the new machine and its current codebooks, specifically the Wetterkurzschlüssel, or weather short signal key, and the Kurzsignal heft, or short signal book, breaking the shark cipher could take months, perhaps years. They did not have years. They barely had weeks. The order went out to the Royal Navy, unspoken but understood. Capture a U-boat. Do not just sink it. Do not just drive it away. Board it. This was a directive that bordered on the suicidal. U-boat crews were strictly disciplined to scuttle their vessels at the first sign of capture, opening valves and setting explosive charges to ensure their secrets sank with them. To board a sinking submarine, amidst a firefight, before the Germans could destroy their Enigma machine, required a convergence of luck, violence, and speed that seemed impossible to engineer. Yet in the warm, dangerous waters of the Mediterranean, far from the freezing gales of the North Atlantic, a Royal Navy destroyer was prowling, unaware that it was about to be handed that impossible opportunity. The stage was set, not by a grand fleet admiral, but by the movements of a single U-boat, U-559, and the aggressive, sometimes reckless persistence of a destroyer named HMS Petard. While the Atlantic froze, the Mediterranean boiled. By late 1942, this sea was the central artery for the war in North Africa. General Montgomery's 8th Army was preparing for the decisive offensive at El Alamein, and the supply lines running to Egypt were critical. Consequently, the Mediterranean became a dense, violent theater of operations, where the Royal Navy clashed daily with the Italian Regia Marina and the German Luftwaffe. But beneath the surface, a silent, deadly game was being played. German U-boats had slipped past Gibraltar to disrupt these supply lines, turning the warm waters into a perilous gauntlet for Allied convoys. Warfare at sea had evolved into a contest of technology, as much as seamanship. The primary weapon of the hunter was ASTIC, or sonar, a system that sent sound waves pinging through the water to detect submerged objects. But the true game changer was high-frequency direction finding, known as HUF-DUF. Unlike radar, which saw objects, HUF-DUF listened. It triangulated the short-wave radio transmissions U-boats used to communicate with Berlin. When a U-boat surfaced to report its position or sightings, HUF-DUF stations on shore and aboard ships could fix its location with terrifying accuracy. It stripped the submarine of its greatest asset, invisibility. Into this high-tech arena sailed the HMS Petard. She was a P-class destroyer, a sleek, fast warship designed for fleet defense and submarine hunting. But a ship is only as effective as its commander, and the Petard was driven by Lieutenant Commander Mark Thornton. Thornton was not a typical officer. He was a man who treated war as a personal vendetta. Known for his supreme physical fitness and an aggressive, almost reckless fighting spirit, he drilled his crew relentlessly. He was a polarizing figure, respected for his competence but feared for his intensity. Under his command, the Petard was not just patrolling, it was stalking. Thornton's philosophy was simple: destruction. He had little patience for the defensive mindset of convoy escort duty. He wanted to kill U-boats. This aggression filtered down to his crew. They were sharp, exhausted, and constantly on edge, molded by a commander who believed that hesitation was a capital offense. This culture of aggressive initiative is crucial to understanding what happened next. On a more disciplined, cautious ship, a 16-year-old boy in the canteen would have been told to stay below decks and keep his head down. On Thornton's Petard, every man was expected to act. On October 30th, the hunt began. A Royal Air Force Wellesley bomber spotted a shadow beneath the waves north of Port Said, a periscope feathering the water. It was U-509. The coordinates were relayed to the waiting destroyers. HMS Petard, along with her sisters Pakenham and Hero, turned their bows toward the contact. They were not looking to scare the U-boat off. They were coming to finish it. The trap was set, bringing together a relentless captain, a desperate U-boat crew, and a teenager who had no business being in a war zone, yet was about to become its most unlikely pivot point. To understand the magnitude of what happened that night, one must look away from the bridge and down into the galley. Among the hardened sailors and career officers of HMS Petard was Thomas Brown, a boy from North Shields who lived in a different world entirely. He was 16 years old. In the eyes of the law, he was a child. In the eyes of the Royal Navy, he was a canteen assistant. Brown was not a soldier. He was an employee of the NAFI, the Navy, Army, and Air Force Institutes. This was a civilian organization tasked with running canteens and shops aboard warships and on bases, selling cigarettes, chocolate, and home comforts to the troops. Technically, NAFI staff were non-combatants. They wore a merchant Navy-style uniform, but their duty was to boost morale, not to fight. Their war was supposed to be one of inventory lists and tea urns, not boarding parties and pistols. But Tommy Brown was there because of a lie. Desperate to escape the grim poverty of the industrial Northeast and see the world, he had forged his papers to enlist, claiming he was older than he was. He had traded the grey skies of Tyneside for the sweltering heat of the Mediterranean, landing on a ship commanded by one of the most aggressive captains in the fleet. His daily existence on the Petard was a strange juxtaposition. While the gunners drilled on the 4-inch guns and the sonar operators listened for the ping of death, Tommy was scrubbing floors, stocking shelves, and serving biscuits. He was the canteen lad, a figure usually ignored or treated with mild affection by the older crew. He had no tactical training. He had never been taught how to clear a room with a submachine gun or how to salvage documents from a sinking vessel. He was simply a support worker, a background character in the theater of war. Yet there was something in Brown's character that defied his job description. He had watched the crew absorb the intensity of Captain Thornton's discipline and silently integrated himself into the ship's fighting spirit. When the alarm bells rang, most NAFI staff would retreat to their designated safety stations. Brown did not. He lingered. He watched. He waited. On the night of October 30th, as the Petard shuddered from the recoil of her own weapons, Tommy Brown was not hiding in the canteen. He was on deck, adrenaline suppressing his fear, watching the black water, ready to do a job he was never hired to do. 300 feet beneath the surface, the war looked very different. Inside U-509, the world had shrunk to a steel tube less than 7 meters wide. For Kapitan Lieutenant Hans Heitmann and his crew, the Mediterranean was not a strategic theater. It was a cage. Heitmann was an experienced commander, a Knight's Cross holder who had sunk nearly 40,000 tons of Allied shipping. But experience offers little protection against the physics of a depth charge. Life inside a U-boat under attack was a sensory nightmare. The air was foul, recycled through carbon dioxide scrubbers that barely kept pace with 40 breathing men. The heat was stifling, often rising above 40 degrees Celsius in the Mediterranean waters, turning the boat into a sweatbox. Silence was the only defense. Men moved in socks, whispering, terrified that dropping a wrench could send a sound spike through the hull to the listening ears of the British destroyers above. They were blind, relying entirely on their hydrophones to track the screws of the Petard, circling overhead like a vulture. Every ping of the Asdic hitting the hull sounded like a hammer striking an empty tank, a psychological torture that signaled the enemy knew exactly where they were. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away in Buckinghamshire, a different kind of pressure was building. At Bletchley Park, the silence was of a different nature. In Hut 8, the team led by Alan Turing and Hugh Alexander was staring at a mathematical abyss. The German Navy's introduction of the shark key on the M4 Enigma had blinded them. They knew the theory of the machine, but without the daily settings, the keys that told the operators which rotors to use and how to configure the plug board, the number of potential combinations was astronomical. They didn't need a miracle of engineering. They needed paper. They needed the Wetterkurzschlüssel and the Kurzsignal heft. These documents allowed U-boats to transmit weather reports and contact signals using short, compressed codes to minimize radio time. If Bletchley could get these books, they could use the weather reports, which were easier to predict and decrypt, as a crib, a backdoor to crack the daily Enigma settings for the entire Atlantic fleet. But these books were the most guarded secrets in the Third Reich, printed on water-soluble paper with red ink that would dissolve the moment it touched water. The link between the sweating, terrified men in U559 and the desperate mathematicians in Hut 8 was about to be forged by high explosives. Heitmann was trying to save his ship. Thornton was trying to kill it. Neither man knew that the outcome would hinge not on the torpedoes or the depth charges, but on whether a few sheets of paper could be snatched from the sea before they dissolved forever. The waiting was over. The Petard began its run. The clock ticked past 2,200 hours. The hunt had been grinding on for 10 agonizing hours. U-559 was no longer maneuvering. It was merely surviving. Above, the destroyers Petard, Pakenham, Hero, and Herworth were executing a relentless choreography of destruction. They took turns making attack runs, dropping patterns of depth charges that bracketed the submerged vessel. Down in the dark, the German crew was at the breaking point. The hull was groaning under the concussive blows. Rivets popped like pistol shots inside the cabin. The lights had failed, leaving the men in emergency red lighting, surrounded by the hiss of escaping high-pressure air and the ominous trickle of seawater entering through cracked seals. Kapitän Lieutenant Heitmann realized the game was up. His batteries were smashed, his oxygen was low, and the pressure hull was compromised. If they stayed down, they would be crushed. He gave the order to blow the ballast tanks. Surface, surface. On the bridge of the Petard, the lookout screamed the contact. A torrent of white foam broke the black surface of the Mediterranean as U-559 erupted from the depths, less than a mile away. Immediately, the night turned into day. Searchlights from the Petard slammed onto the conning tower, pinning the grey wolf against the dark backdrop. The destroyer's Oerlikon 20mm cannons opened up, raking the deck to suppress any attempt by the Germans to man their deck gun. But Captain Thornton saw something else. The U-boat was not firing back. Hatches were flying open. Men were scrambling out, hands raised or diving into the sea. The German crew was abandoning ship. This was the moment the Admiralty had dreamed of. The U-boat was stationary, wallowing in the swell, and, crucially, it had not yet blown apart. Thornton barked a ceasefire order. Cease firing! Boarding party away, the Petard maneuvered dangerously close, risking a collision to close the gap. On the deck, First Lieutenant Tony Fasson, the ship's executive officer, was already moving. He was a tall, dashing Scot, the son of a vice-admiral, born for this kind of swashbuckling action. Alongside him was able seaman Colin Grazier, a quiet, dependable regular from the Midlands. They stripped off their heavy gear, preparing to leap onto the enemy vessel. And then there was Tommy Brown. The 16-year-old canteen assistant saw the officers running toward the rail. He didn't have orders. He didn't have a weapon. He just saw that the whaler boat was taking too long to launch, and the U-boat looked like it could slip beneath the waves at any second. If they were going to get whatever was inside, they had to go now. Fasson and Grazier didn't wait for the whaler. As the Petard pulled alongside the rolling U-boat, they leaped across the gap, boots skidding on the wet, oil-slick steel of the casing. Tommy Brown followed them. He hit the deck of the submarine, the metal shuddering beneath him like a dying animal. The sea was washing over the low freeboard, threatening to sweep them off into the black water. But they scrambled up the side of the conning tower. At the hatch, the darkness below was absolute. The German crew had opened the seacocks, valves designed to flood the boat, before they abandoned ship. The vessel was already settling lower by the stern. Fasson, the senior officer, didn't hesitate. He dropped down the vertical ladder into the belly of the enemy machine. Grazier followed instantly. Brown stationed himself at the top of the ladder. His legs braced against the rung, acting as the human chain between the interior of the U-boat and the outside world. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The emergency lights were flickering, casting long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with chlorine gas from seawater mixing with the batteries. Water was already calf-deep in the control room, swirling with debris and oil. Fasson and Grazier knew exactly what they were looking for. They ignored the machinery and smashed their way into the captain's cabin. Time was measured in seconds. They tore open drawers and lockers, hunting for the weighted bags that confidential documents were kept in. They found them. The Kurzsignalheft, the Wetterkurzschlüssel, the keys to the Atlantic. Fasson grabbed the documents, the water now rising past his knees. He rushed back to the foot of the ladder and thrust the bundle up to Grazier, who passed them up to Brown. The teenager grabbed the wet books, shielding them with his body, and scrambled up to the bridge to shout for the Petard's whaler, which was now bobbing alongside. He tossed the priceless intelligence into the boat, shouting for them to keep it dry. Below, the water was rising faster. The angle of the deck was becoming steep. Fasson and Grazier went back. They knew the danger. They knew the boat was groaning, the bulkhead screaming under the pressure. But there was more to get. Potentially the Enigma machine itself, or more keys. They were greedy for intelligence, driven by the knowledge that this chance would never come again. Suddenly, U-559 gave a violent lurch. The stern dropped like a stone. The sea poured into the conning tower hatch with the force of a waterfall. Brown, still perched on the ladder, was nearly sucked down by the inrushing torrent. He kicked free, scrambling desperately out of the hatch as the ocean swallowed the tower. He leaped into the churning water just as the U-boat began its terminal dive. Below him, the steel hatch slammed shut, or was overwhelmed by the pressure. Fasson and Grazier were trapped. There was no way out. In the pitch black, amidst the rising water and the crushing pressure, 2 of the bravest men in the Royal Navy died, dragged down hundreds of feet to the bottom of the Mediterranean. They had traded their lives for a stack of paper. Tommy Brown was pulled from the oil-stained water, shivering and in shock, the only witness to their sacrifice. The U-boat was gone, but safe in the whaler, dry and intact, lay the books that would break the shark. The documents rescued from the U-559 traveled under armed guard, faster than any diplomat, from Port Said to the quiet, leafy grounds of Bletchley Park. When they arrived on the desk of the cryptanalysts in Hut 8, they were more than just wet paper. They were the Holy Grail. The Wetterkursschlüssel provided the exact templates U-boats used to report local weather conditions. Because the Allies already knew the weather in those locations, they now had a crib, a known piece of plain text that corresponded to the encrypted message. On December 13th, 1942, 3 weeks after the sinking, the breakthrough happened. The bomber machines fed with the data derived from Fasson, Grazier, and Brown's prize clicked into place. The 4-rotor M4 Enigma, the shark, was broken. For the first time in 10 months, the lights turned back on in the Atlantic. The effect was immediate and devastating for the German U-boat command. Suddenly, the Royal Navy knew exactly where the wolf packs were forming. Convoys that had been sailing blindly into ambushes were now steered around them, often by margins of just a few miles. In the bunkers of Lorient and Brest, U-boat commanders were baffled. They would surface at their designated attack coordinates only to find an empty ocean. The grey wolves began to starve. The statistics tell the story better than any speech. In the months prior to the capture, Allied shipping losses had been catastrophic, peaking at over 700,000 tons in November. By January and February 1943, as the intelligence from U-559 was integrated into Admiralty planning, those losses plummeted. By May 1943, known as Black May for the Germans, the hunters became the hunted. The Allies sank 43 U-boats in a single month, a loss rate that Admiral Dönitz could not sustain. He withdrew his fleet from the North Atlantic. The supply lines to Britain were secured, and the build-up for D-Day could begin in earnest. Historians estimate that the intelligence gained from U-559 shortened the war in Europe by several months, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. But the men who paid the price for this victory were not there to see it. The Admiralty was faced with a grim problem. They could not publicize the heroism of the boarding party. If the Germans learned that men had entered U-559 and retrieved documents, they would instantly change their codes and the Enigma machines, rendering the sacrifice meaningless. The victory had to remain a secret. The silence surrounding the incident was absolute. The Admiralty faced a paradoxical dilemma. Fasson, Grazier, and Brown had performed one of the most significant acts of courage in naval history, yet they could not be publicly celebrated. To award the Victoria Cross, the highest honor for gallantry, required a public citation detailing the action. Publishing the details would tell Berlin that their codes were compromised. So the heroes were hidden behind vague bureaucracy. Fasson and Grazier were posthumously awarded the George Cross. Tommy Brown was awarded the George Medal. The citation spoke only of bravery in saving life at sea, a deliberate understatement that buried the truth in plain sight. For Tommy Brown, the aftermath was a bewildering return to reality. He was the sole survivor of the boarding party, a 16-year-old boy carrying the weight of seeing 2 men die to save a bundle of books. His war ended not with a parade, but with a paperwork check. During the inquiry following the sinking, the Navy finally looked closely at his records and discovered his true age. He was immediately discharged. The boy who had helped break the Enigma was sent home to North Shields, back to the poverty he had tried to escape, labeled a civilian once more. His life after the Petard was tragically short. He returned to work as a bricklayer's apprentice, carrying the secret of that night in the Mediterranean. He never saw the victory parades of 1945. In February of that year, just months before the war in Europe ended, a fire broke out in his family's tenement home in North Shields. With the same instinctive courage he showed on the U-boat, Tommy repeatedly ran into the burning building to save his family. He rescued his sister, Maureen, but was trapped by the smoke and flames. He died at the age of 19. A war hero who survived the depth charges and the U-boats, only to be taken by a house fire in his hometown. It would take decades for the truth to surface. The ultra-secret, the story of Bletchley Park, was classified until the 1970s. For 30 years, the families of Fasson and Grazier, and the surviving relatives of Tommy Brown, had no idea that their sons had effectively turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. They believed they had died in a generic naval engagement. When the files were finally opened, the world realized that the survival of Britain had hinged on 3 men in a sinking metal tube, and the youngest of them was a boy who shouldn't have been there at all. History often focuses on the generals, the maps, and the grand strategies. We are taught that wars are won by industrial might and technological superiority. But the story of U-559 and the breaking of the Shark cipher reminds us that sometimes the fate of nations hangs on the smallest of hinges. The Battle of the Atlantic was a clash of millions of tons of steel and billions of dollars in technology. Yet, the decisive moment did not come from a battleship or a bomber. It came from 3 pairs of hands fumbling in the dark, cold water. It came from the decision of a 16-year-old boy, Thomas Brown, who stepped forward when he could have stood back. Brown, Fasson, and Grazier did not know they were saving the Atlantic convoys. They did not know they were shortening the war. They only knew that there was a job to be done, and the window to do it was closing. Their legacy is not just in the ships that didn't sink or the battles that were won because of the intelligence they seized. It is in the enduring truth that in the machinery of war, the human spirit remains the only variable that cannot be calculated, predicted, or broken.